For more than 30 years, Johnny Carson wasn't just the face of late-night television, he was its gatekeeper. A single appearance on The Tonight Show could legitimize a career, while a bad one could quietly close doors forever. Carson's real power was never loud or cruel. It was subtle, disciplined, and absolute. His genius was control. He controlled tone, timing, and boundaries with a glance, a pause, or a perfectly placed joke. Presidents trusted him. Movie stars depended on him. For years, the system worked flawlessly. But what happens when the system stops listening? What happens when the most controlled man on television suddenly loses control of his own show? And if those moments happen today, would they be remembered as disasters, or clipped, shared, and monetized as viral content? In Carson's era, there were no PR teams, no social media spin, and no delay button. When something went wrong, it happened live in front of millions with no safety net. And sometimes, what followed wasn't just awkward. It was chaotic, dangerous, and deeply human. Tonight, we're not revisiting these moments for cheap shock. We're looking back at the nights when Carson's legendary composure was truly tested, when guests crossed sexual boundaries, turned the set into chaos, or unraveled emotionally on live television. Because Johnny Carson rarely punished chaos on air. He punished it later through silence, absence, and who was never invited back. This isn't a story about unhinged guests. It's about the fragile line between control and collapse, and the man whose job was to hold that line, no matter the cost. In 1979, long before he became the Terminator or a global movie star, Arnold Schwarzenegger walked onto The Tonight Show as something very different, a young bodybuilder overflowing with confidence and completely untrained in television etiquette. At the time, Arnold wasn't there to shock anyone. He was promoting Pumping Iron, a documentary about bodybuilding, discipline, and physical transformation. To Johnny Carson, this looked like a safe booking. Athletes were familiar territory. The conversation began exactly as expected: training routines, competition, the physical demands of the sport. Then Johnny asked a simple, innocent question. He asked Arnold to describe the pump the sensation bodybuilders feel when blood floods the muscles after intense training. And in that moment, Carson could be seen recalibrating in real time, because Arnold didn't answer like a guest who understood the stage he was standing on. "The pump is like having sex with a woman and coming," Arnold said, without hesitation. And he didn't stop there. What followed was a graphic, explicit comparison that shattered the unwritten rules of 1,970 seconds network television. In an era when even married couples were still portrayed sleeping in separate beds on TV, Arnold's words landed like a grenade. Was Arnold deliberately pushing boundaries, or did he genuinely have no idea that he had just crossed a line television hadn't even named yet? And when Johnny Carson tugged at his tie, visibly searching for control, was that the first moment he realized that a new kind of masculinity had arrived, one television wasn't ready for? Carson didn't scold him. He didn't shut him down aggressively. Instead, he did something more revealing. He tried to steer the conversation back to safer ground, but the damage was already done. The control booth panicked. Network executives reportedly began calling mid-segment. In Johnny Carson's mind, this wasn't playful chaos. It wasn't controlled. It wasn't malicious either. It was something more dangerous, a guest who didn't understand the boundaries and therefore couldn't respect them. The punishment didn't come that night. Arnold finished the segment. The audience laughed nervously. Carson cracked a joke to regain balance. But after the cameras stopped rolling, a quiet decision was made. Schwarzenegger would not be invited back for years. Because Carson rarely punished chaos on air, he punished it later by closing the gate. What makes this moment even more revealing is what happened next. Arnold Schwarzenegger did return to The Tonight Show, but not immediately, and not unchanged. When he appeared again in the early 1,980 seconds, he was visibly different, more polished, more careful. The raw, unfiltered bravado was gone, replaced by a version of Arnold who understood the rules of the room. Johnny Carson noticed. This time, Carson steered the conversation with surgical precision, deliberately avoiding any territory that could invite another boundary collapse. There were no questions about the pump, no openings for metaphors. The message was clear: you're welcome back, but only if you play by the rules. Arnold had learned something essential. Talent and confidence could get you noticed, but control was what earned you a second invitation. And Carson had made his point without ever saying it out loud. The gate hadn't been permanently closed, but it had been firmly reinforced. In 1974, The Tonight Show was running with near-perfect precision, and Johnny Carson generally enjoyed having Burt Reynolds as a guest. Reynolds was charming, relaxed, and quick with a story, exactly the kind of movie star who understood the rhythm of Carson's stage. But on this particular night, Reynolds appeared alongside his close friend, comedian Dom DeLuise, and what was supposed to be a standard interview quickly began drifting towards something far less controlled. DeLuise arrived with a can of whipped cream, claiming it was meant to demonstrate a cooking technique he was known for, while exchanging knowing glances with Reynolds that suggested mischief was already planned. Carson sensed it immediately and remarked, with the caution of a man who had hosted thousands of guests, that he had a feeling this was not really about cooking. Without warning, DeLuise fired the first shot, spraying whipped cream directly at Reynolds. Reynolds responded instinctively, grabbing a pitcher of water from Carson's desk and dumping its entire contents down DeLuise's pants. The studio audience exploded with shocked laughter as the two men escalated into a full-blown food fight, something almost unheard of on late-night television at the time. Carson initially appeared amused, even indulgent, until the chaos spilled onto him. Reynolds grabbed the whipped cream can and sprayed a long streak straight across Carson's suit and desk. In a rare flash of irritation, Carson exclaimed, "That's a $500 suit," a line that cut through the laughter and revealed that this had crossed from playful to personal. When physical chaos replaces conversation, is it still a talk show, or has the format itself collapsed? And when the host becomes the target, how much control does he really have left? Although Carson's smile never fully disappeared, longtime viewers could see the difference. This was not his genuine laugh, but what writers later described as the laugh that meant someone was in serious trouble once the cameras stopped rolling. By the end of the segment, the damage was undeniable. The famous Tonight Show carpet was soaked, Carson's desk was dripping with whipped cream, and the set was in no condition for the remaining guests scheduled that night. During the commercial break, Carson was reportedly heard muttering to his producer that this was why he should never book friends, because they think they can get away with murder. The cleanup delayed the next segment, forcing NBC to extend the commercial break, a rare disruption to the show's meticulously timed format. The consequences, as always with Carson, did not come on air. After the show, Reynolds sent Carson a replacement suit as a peace offering, while DeLuise reportedly sent a case of industrial-strength carpet cleaner to the studio. Carson, ever the professional, referenced the incident the following night with a dry joke, telling the audience that the show was now brought to them by cleaning companies. Yet behind the humor was a clear message. Reynolds and DeLuise were invited back individually many times, but never together again. The chaos had been reclassified in Carson's mind. Not clever rebellion, not controlled mayhem, but a breach of physical boundaries. And while Carson could forgive the mess, he never forgot who caused it. Few guests embodied old Hollywood excess quite like Zsa Zsa Gabor, and for the most part, Johnny Carson welcomed it. Gabor appeared on The Tonight Show more than 100 times, reliably delivering glamorous anecdotes, outrageous flirtation, and stories about diamonds, divorces, and powerful men. She was uninhibited, but usually predictable. That's why her 1,979 appearance caught even Carson off guard. The interview began exactly as audiences expected, with Gabor sweeping onto the stage in a cloud of perfume and fur, calling Carson darling in her thick Hungarian accent, and settling into her familiar role as the unapologetic embodiment of indulgent celebrity culture. About 5 minutes into the conversation, Carson casually asked Gabor about a recent vacation to the south of France. What followed instantly shifted the tone of the segment. Without hesitation, Gabor reached into her purse and pulled out a tiny gold bikini, triumphantly holding it up for the cameras. She announced that it was the swimsuit she had been wearing when she met one of her former husbands on the beach at Cannes, momentarily pausing to wonder aloud whether he had been her fourth or fifth. The studio erupted in laughter, while Carson reached instinctively for his water glass, visibly processing what had just happened. In an era of strict broadcast standards, this was already pushing limits. But Gabor was only getting started. Holding the bikini aloft, she launched into a graphic account of the sexual encounter that followed, declaring that the man had followed her back to her hotel and very clearly had not come to borrow sugar. At that moment, Carson was no longer hosting a playful interview. He was attempting damage control. The network censor was reportedly panicking in the control booth, aware that there was no delay button and no way to retract what was being said live. Gabor compounded the situation by naming several famous men who had supposedly admired her while she wore the bikini, some of whom were married at the time. Carson gently attempted to intervene, suggesting that some of these gentlemen might prefer privacy, but Gabor waved him off with a bejeweled hand, declaring that privacy was for ugly people. "When you look like Zsa Zsa," she insisted, "the world deserves to know." Was this calculated provocation, or did Gabor truly believe that her glamour placed her above the rules of television entirely? And at what point does charm stop being entertaining and start becoming a liability? The segment crossed into surreal territory when Gabor insisted that Carson hold the bikini top against his chest for the audience to see. Trapped between maintaining decorum and keeping the show from collapsing entirely, Carson reluctantly complied, his expression caught somewhere between amusement and genuine mortification. This was not drunken chaos or emotional collapse. In Carson's mind, Gabor represented something different, a guest who was completely immune to embarrassment and uninterested in boundaries. She wasn't out of control, she simply refused to acknowledge that control existed. When the segment finally ended, Carson carefully returned the bikini to Gabor using only his thumb and forefinger, as if minimizing physical contact might somehow distance him from the scandal unfolding on his own stage. The aftermath made the power dynamic unmistakably clear. Carson reportedly received angry phone calls from several men mentioned during the interview, to which he responded with characteristic detachment, explaining that he had no more control over Zsa Zsa Gabor than he did over natural disasters. Yet despite the chaos, Gabor continued to be invited back, a rare exception that revealed how Carson categorized danger. She was not a threat to the structure of the show. She was a force of nature, and in Johnny Carson's universe, those were sometimes allowed as long as he survived the storm. In 1975, Red Fox was riding high as the star of Sanford and Son, one of NBC's biggest hits, and his appearance on The Tonight Show was meant to be a celebration of that success. Johnny Carson admired Fox's groundbreaking comedy and volatile brilliance, and on paper, this was a prestige booking for both men. But trouble began before Foxx ever reached the famous couch. A heavy smoker who was rarely seen without a cigarette, Foxx was informed backstage that NBC had just implemented a strict no-smoking policy on set. His reaction was immediate and explosive. "No smoke, no joke," he reportedly shouted, loud enough for Carson to hear from behind the curtain, as producers tried to explain that the rule was network-mandated and non-negotiable. When the show returned from commercial, viewers saw none of that tension at first. Carson introduced Foxx warmly, as always, and Foxx walked out, shook his hand, and sat down. But almost instantly, the unease was visible. Instead of answering Carson's opening question about his hit series, Foxx brought the backstage dispute directly onto live television, bluntly announcing that he'd been told he couldn't smoke. Carson, caught off guard by having an off-camera conflict dragged into the open, tried to defuse the situation with humor, explaining that it was a new network policy and not his personal decision. For Carson, this was the worst kind of chaos, not wild behavior, not drunken rambling, but a direct challenge to the structure and authority of the show itself. When a guest turns a private disagreement into a public confrontation on live television, is the interview still a conversation? Or has it become a test of dominance? And if the host yields even slightly, what message does that send to everyone watching? Foxx was not interested in compromise. He framed the issue as a matter of respect, pointing out that he'd been in the business for decades and arguing that if other stars could indulge their habits on television, he should be allowed to do the same. Carson, himself a smoker in earlier years, tried again to smooth things over, joking that maybe they could both sneak outside for a cigarette after the show. It was the wrong move. Foxx stood up, straightened his jacket, and declared that he didn't perform where he wasn't respected. Then, with cameras rolling and the audience gasping, he repeated his backstage line, "No smoke, no joke," and walked off the set mid-interview. Carson was visibly stunned. After a brief, awkward silence, he turned to Ed McMahon and dryly announced they'd be going to commercial early, a rare admission that something had gone seriously wrong. When the show returned, Carson addressed the situation with his trademark restraint, telling the audience that he was just as surprised as they were, and then calmly moved on with the rest of the broadcast. Behind the scenes, however, the fallout was severe. Producers panicked. Network executives were furious, and Carson himself was reportedly angered not by Fox's desire to smoke, but by his willingness to create an uncomfortable power struggle on live television. In Carson's internal calculus, Foxx wasn't a force of nature or a tragic figure. He was a guest who had violated the cardinal rule. Whatever happens backstage, you protect the show once the cameras roll. The consequence came quietly. It would be years before Red Fox was invited back, and the relationship between host and guest never fully recovered. By the mid-1970s, Truman Capote was no longer just a celebrated literary figure. He had become a symbol of creative brilliance eroding in public. Earlier appearances on The Tonight Show during the 1,960 seconds had shown Capote at his best, witty, articulate, and irresistibly sharp, following the success of In Cold Blood. Johnny Carson admired him deeply and continued to invite him back, even as Capote's struggles with alcohol and drugs became increasingly visible. That loyalty would be tested in November 1975 during what remains one of the most uncomfortable interviews in the show's history. From the moment Capote stepped onto the set, something was clearly wrong. He moved unsteadily, requiring assistance to reach his chair, his speech already slurred before Carson had asked a single question. His eyes wandered, unfocused, and the makeup department's efforts could not disguise his gray complexion or the sense that he hadn't slept in days. Carson's face briefly registered shock before he composed himself, instinctively shifting from interviewer to caretaker. When he opened with a gentle question about Capote's writing projects, the response that followed was rambling, incoherent, and painfully long. Capote spoke of unfinished work, of beautiful people who had betrayed him, and of secrets he intended to expose, drifting in and out of thoughts that never quite connected. At first, the audience laughed uncertainly, unsure whether they were witnessing eccentricity or something far more troubling. As the minutes passed, the laughter faded into silence. Capote dabbed his forehead with a crumpled handkerchief, smearing makeup across his temple, seemingly unaware of the cameras or the millions watching at home. Carson continued nodding politely, throwing out simple, focused questions like lifelines, hoping Capote might grab onto something coherent. But nothing worked. This was no longer entertainment. It was a man unraveling in real time. When Carson asked about Capote's relationship with Perry Smith, one of the murderers from In Cold Blood, Capote spoke of him in the present tense, forgetting that Smith had been executed years earlier. His voice cracked, his eyes filled with tears, and the studio fell into complete silence. At what point does an interview stop being content and become an ethical dilemma? And when a guest is clearly not at their best, is the host's job to keep the show moving or to stop it altogether? Recognizing that the situation had crossed a line that could not be reversed, Carson gently signaled for an early commercial break, something he almost never did unless there was a genuine emergency. As the cameras cut away, he leaned toward Capote and placed a steadying hand on his arm, not as a performer but as a human being. When the show returned, Capote was gone. Carson transitioned smoothly to the next segment without explanation, shielding the audience from further discomfort and Capote from additional exposure. Behind the scenes, Carson personally ensured that Capote was escorted back to his hotel and insisted that someone stay with him, reportedly repeating, "Make sure he's not alone tonight." The aftermath revealed how Carson categorized danger. Capote was not chaos to be punished, nor spectacle to be mined for laughs. He was a tragedy unfolding, and Carson refused to exploit it. He never referenced the interview in monologues, never replayed it for humor, and never framed it as entertainment. Years later, when asked about difficult guests, Carson would allude to the moment only obliquely, explaining that sometimes people aren't at their best and that a host's responsibility is to get everyone through it with as much grace as possible. In a medium built on exposure, this was Carson's quiet line in the sand proof that control sometimes means knowing when to stop. By May 1987, Madonna was at the height of her provocateur era. Her Who's That Girl tour was about to launch, and controversy had become part of her brand. Still, few expected her appearance on The Tonight Show to become one of the most uncomfortable interviews of Johnny Carson's career. From the moment Madonna walked on stage in a black lace outfit that barely met broadcast standards, it was clear she had no intention of playing by the show's unwritten rules. Instead of sitting at the customary distance, she positioned herself unusually close to Carson, quietly challenging the physical dynamics he had controlled for decades. The interview quickly escalated from flirtation to overt sexual provocation. When Carson asked about her upcoming film, Madonna bypassed safe promotional answers and described a scene that had been cut for being too explicit, leaning closer as she spoke. Carson attempted to redirect with a neutral clarification, "So it's a comedy then?" But Madonna responded by inviting him to her hotel to show him what had been removed, a line delivered with a deliberate wink to the camera. The audience reacted with a mix of gasps and nervous laughter as Carson tugged at his tie, a familiar gesture viewers recognized as genuine discomfort. Was Madonna simply pushing boundaries for attention, or was she deliberately attempting to flip the power structure of the interview itself? And when provocation becomes physical and persistent, does the host still control the room, or is he being tested? The situation intensified when Madonna made a remark so explicit that the network censor activated the 5-second delay, resulting in a brief, unmistakable silence that alerted viewers something inappropriate had been said. According to staff, the delay button was used multiple times during that single interview, an unprecedented event for The Tonight Show. Carson, now fully in damage control mode, tried to reassert authority with humor, joking that perhaps he should have booked Mother Teresa instead. Madonna responded by placing her hand on Carson's knee, crossing one of the show's most rigid, unspoken boundaries. Physical contact initiated by a guest was rare, and the camera caught Carson's expression shift from professional amusement to genuine unease as Ed McMahon interjected to deflect the moment. Behind the scenes, producers reportedly prepared to cut to commercial if the interview escalated further. Carson, drawing on decades of experience, gradually steered the conversation toward Madonna's music, carefully closing off every opening that could lead back to explicit territory. When the segment finally ended, his relief was visible. Afterward, network executives quietly requested that Madonna not be booked again during Carson's tenure. In Carson's internal calculus, this wasn't playful chaos or a tragic unraveling, it was a calculated power play, one that threatened the structure of the show itself. And while Madonna left having proven she could make America blush, Carson proved something else entirely. Even provocation had limits on The Tonight Show, and crossing them had consequences. Unlike most of the chaos Johnny Carson faced, Don Rickles was not a surprise guest, a breakdown, or a provocation gone wrong. Rickles was something far more dangerous, a close friend. Their relationship was built on mock hostility, rapid-fire insults, and an understanding that what looked like an attack was actually a performance. Rickles' appearances were always anticipated, precisely because he pushed boundaries in ways other guests never dared. That's why what happened in 1976 was so unsettling. Not because Rickles insulted Carson, but because he broke the one rule even friends were expected to respect. The night began routinely enough. Carson was in the middle of a standard interview with actor Robert Blake, promoting his hit series Beretta, when sudden commotion erupted backstage. Without warning, Rickles burst through the curtains, completely uninvited and unscheduled, shouting that he'd just come from the Dinah Shore show next door and had heard Carson saying terrible things about him. For a brief moment, Carson's face registered genuine shock. This was not a planned bit. He glanced off stage toward the producers, a silent question asking whether anyone knew what was happening before instinctively shifting into survival mode. Carson ad-libbed smoothly, joking that Rickles had escaped from his handlers, but Rickles had no intention of making a quick cameo and leaving. Instead, Rickles dragged a chair onto the set and inserted himself directly into Blake's interview, mocking both men and completely hijacking the segment. He grabbed Carson's coffee mug, complained it wasn't real coffee, rifled through drawers on Carson's desk, and openly insulted the show's furniture and production values. Each escalation drew bigger laughs, but also more panic in the control booth. Rickles even wandered behind the desk, a space guests were never supposed to enter, and snapped the rabbit ears off a decorative television prop. Carson warned him half-jokingly that it would come out of his paycheck, but Rickles waved it off, insisting NBC could afford it. Was this still controlled chaos, the kind Carson tolerated because it produced great television? Or had Rickles crossed into something riskier by seizing control of the show itself? And when the audience is laughing, how far can a host let disorder go before authority evaporates entirely? Behind the scenes, producers were reportedly frantic. This wasn't just a guest going off script. It was a total takeover of the program during a live broadcast with no delay and no safety net. Carson, recognizing that fighting Rickles would only make the situation worse, made a calculated decision. He leaned back, lit a cigarette, still permitted on television at the time, and let Rickles run. It was surrender, but a strategic one. Carson understood that Rickles thrived on resistance, and denying him that resistance was the only way to regain control without detonating the show. After nearly 20 minutes of chaos, Carson finally steered the segment into a commercial break, and Rickles was persuaded to leave the set. The aftermath revealed the distinction Carson always made between chaos and threat. Unlike other guests, Rickles was not punished. He was not banned. He was invited back repeatedly. Why? Because Carson never classified Rickles as a danger to the structure of The Tonight Show. Rickles operated within a shared understanding, reckless, invasive, but ultimately loyal to the show itself. Carson later joked about increasing studio security and adding Rickles to the FBI's most wanted list, turning the invasion into legend rather than scandal. It was the clearest example of controlled chaos, dangerous enough to electrify live television, but contained by trust, history, and Carson's instinct for when to let go and when to pull the reins back. By 1975, tension surrounding Truman Capote had followed him everywhere. Excerpts from his unfinished novel Answered Prayers had ignited outrage among New York's elite, many of whom recognized themselves in his thinly veiled portrayals. When Johnny Carson booked Capote, he expected controversy but not open warfare. The situation escalated dramatically when Academy Award-winning actress Shelley Winters joined the segment. What began as a routine transition quickly became one of the most volatile confrontations ever broadcast on The Tonight Show. Carson attempted a light handoff, asking Winters whether she had read Capote's controversial work. Her response was immediate and sharp. She accused Capote of hiding cruelty behind so-called fiction, of betraying people who had welcomed him into their homes. Capote, either oblivious or deliberately provocative, smiled placidly and replied that fiction was often better than truth. That single sentence detonated the room. Winters turned fully toward him, her voice rising into a furious shout that stunned the audience into silence. She accused him of slander, of parasitism, of using intimacy as ammunition. Carson tried to interrupt, but Winters ignored him completely, unleashing a torrent of rage that was clearly not performative. When confrontation replaces conversation, does the host still function as moderator, or has he become an emergency responder? And when two guests stop speaking to the host and begin attacking each other, what authority is left to reclaim? Capote's attempts to respond only worsened the situation. He mocked Winters, suggesting that any resemblance she saw between herself and his characters said more about her than his writing. That remark pushed Winters beyond restraint. She launched into deeply personal attacks about his voice, his appearance, and his lifestyle, much of it skirting and sometimes crossing broadcast standards. Carson's demeanor changed. This was no longer verbal chaos he could guide with humor. It was a confrontation veering toward physical danger. For one of the few times in his career, Carson made the decision to cut to an unscheduled commercial break. As the cameras faded out, viewers could see him physically rise and position himself between Winters and Capote. What happened during the break was even more alarming. Winters continued screaming, and Carson reportedly had to stand up and physically separate the two guests while producers rushed to rearrange the set. When the show returned, the seating had been altered to maximize distance, and Carson addressed the audience with dry understatement, assuring them that no authors or actresses had been harmed. From that moment on, he ran the segment like a crisis manager, directing questions carefully, interrupting instantly at the first sign of escalation, and using his own body language as a barrier. Winters was not drunk. Capote was not unraveling. This was raw, unresolved hostility colliding live on air. In Carson's internal calculus, this was real chaos, unpredictable, combustible, and dangerous to the integrity of the show. When the segment finally ended, Carson's relief was unmistakable. Under his breath, still audible to the microphones, he quipped that if he were lucky, the next segment would involve completely different guests. The confrontation became legend, not because of scandal, but because it revealed something rare. Even Johnny Carson sometimes had to abandon humor and step in physically to protect his program. It was a stark reminder that The Tonight Show was not just a stage, it was a pressure chamber, and when it cracked, Carson's role shifted from host to referee in an instant. By 1975, Oliver Reed already carried a reputation that worried television producers. A powerful screen presence paired with legendary alcohol-fueled behavior, Reed was known as a risk, but one Johnny Carson believed he could manage. Carson had handled intoxicated guests before. He trusted his instincts, his timing, and his ability to redirect even the most difficult personalities. That confidence would be tested the moment Reed arrived at the studio. Staff immediately noticed he was heavily intoxicated, reportedly refusing water or coffee, and demanding scotch instead. Producers warned Carson backstage. Johnny nodded and went on anyway. The trouble was obvious the second Reed stumbled onto the set. What initially drew nervous laughter quickly shifted to discomfort as Reed collapsed into the chair, sprawling without composure. When Carson asked a simple question about Reed's latest film, the response dissolved into a rambling monologue that veered from childhood memories to bar fights in Malta, barely intelligible and entirely unconnected to the question. Reed didn't pause. He didn't listen. He bulldozed forward in a stream of slurred consciousness. Carson attempted his standard technique: nod politely, wait for a breath, redirect, but there were no breaths. The audience's laughter thinned into uneasy silence as Reed's comments grew increasingly sexual, first about actresses, then pointed awkwardly toward Carson himself. At what point does a host stop trying to guide the conversation and accept that control has already been lost? And when a guest is visibly impaired, does continuing the interview serve anyone at all? The situation escalated from awkward to alarming when Reed attempted to stand up to demonstrate a stunt, nearly falling and grabbing Carson's desk for balance, knocking over the host's coffee mug, and spilling water across his notes and suit. For a brief instant, the camera caught something rare, genuine alarm on Carson's face. Behind the scenes, producers were frantically signaling for the segment to end, discussing the unthinkable, cutting to commercial mid-interview. Carson understood immediately. This wasn't chaos that could be reshaped into comedy. It wasn't provocation or rebellion. It was a guest who was no longer capable of functioning on live television. Carson ended the segment early with practiced grace, thanking Reed and suggesting they continue the conversation another time when there would be more opportunity to explore his career. To viewers at home, it sounded polite. To the crew, it was an emergency extraction. As the show cut to commercial, Reed appeared confused, still talking, attempting to follow Carson around the set until security gently escorted him backstage. According to staff, Reed continued speaking through the commercial break, unaware the interview was over. The aftermath was decisive. Network executives were furious, and Carson privately admitted the segment had been beyond saving one of the few times he ever said that. Reed was never invited back to The Tonight Show during Carson's tenure. Yet even here, Carson refused to exploit the disaster. He did not mock Reed, replay the footage for laughs, or turn the moment into legend. Years later, Carson referred to the incident with tact, describing Reed as a tremendously talented actor who had simply been having an enthusiastic evening. In Carson's moral framework, this was the final category of danger, not spectacle, not rebellion, not controlled chaos, but a situation where the only responsible act was to stop. And that restraint, more than the chaos itself, is why Johnny Carson remains unmatched. Looking back at these moments, the drunken, rambling, the sexual provocation, the on-air walkouts, the physical chaos, the emotional breakdowns, it would be easy to remember The Tonight Show as a parade of disasters narrowly avoided. But that would miss the point entirely. What these moments actually reveal is not the madness of the guests, but the discipline of the man who sat behind the desk. Johnny Carson did not survive 3 decades of live television by avoiding chaos. He survived by understanding it. Carson knew that not all chaos was the same. Some guests needed to be indulged, others needed to be gently steered, a few needed to be physically stopped, and in the rarest cases like Oliver Reed, the only responsible choice was to end the moment entirely. Where modern television often exploits breakdowns for clicks and virality, Carson operated by a different code. His instinct was never to humiliate, never to escalate, and never to sacrifice human dignity for spectacle. Even when a guest embarrassed themselves, Carson's priority was to protect the structure of the show and sometimes the guests themselves. What made him singular was not that he always stayed calm, but that he knew when calm was no longer enough. He could surrender control strategically, as with Don Rickles. He could intervene decisively, as with Shelley Winters and Truman Capote. He could shut the door quietly, as he did with Oliver Reed. Each response was different, because each situation demanded something different. That level of judgment cannot be scripted. It can only be learned through years of listening, watching, and understanding human behavior under pressure. And that is why these moments still resonate decades later, not because they were shocking, but because they were real. They remind us of a time when live television had consequences, when there was no delay button to erase discomfort, and when a host had to rely on instinct rather than algorithms. Carson wasn't just moderating interviews. He was managing egos, crises, and unpredictable human beings in real time night after night for 30 years. So the next time a clip from The Tonight Show goes viral for its chaos, the real question isn't, how did that guest lose control? It's, how did Carson keep it from becoming something worse? And in an era where chaos is manufactured on purpose, one final question lingers: would any host today choose restraint over ratings if faced with the same moment?